This video is about compatible numbers. For our purposes today, compatible numbers are going to be defined as numbers that add up to 10 or 100 or 1,000 or another power of 10, numbers that are easy to add in your head. So for instance, 30 plus 70 equals 100, 60 plus 40 equals 100, 200 plus 800 equals 1,000, 900 plus 100 equals 1,000. We use compatible numbers very often when we estimate. And when you estimate, you don't need an exact number. When you estimate is when you don't need an exact number and you want to be able to add or subtract something in your head. So for instance, when you go to the grocery store and you go through the cashier's line and they add up your groceries, that is an exact number. If your bill comes to $99.35, that's exactly what they want you to pay. But when you walked out of the grocery store, you might say to your mom, to your husband, to whomever, when you get in the car with them, you might say, I spent $100 on groceries. Well, really, you only spent $99.35, but you estimated that to 100 because it was very close. So estimates are when you don't need an exact number. And we use them most often in life when we want to add or subtract something in our head. And you don't have to follow strict rounding rules. Now remember, rounding rules are when the number next to a number, so if we have 558 and we're going to round it to the nearest hundreds place, we look next door. If this is a 5, then we're going to bump up this number to a 6 and change the other two digits. We're saying that 558 is rounds to 600. Those are strict rounding rules. If this number was 4, then you would say, oh, well, if I'm rounding to this hundreds place, I look next door, that's a 4, so that means I keep the 5 the same, and it rounds to 500. So with estimating, you don't have to follow strict rounding rules. What you want to do is you want to be able to find compatible numbers. So if we look at this 427 and we look at this 675 and we want to estimate, I could say, oh, well, you know what? This is pretty close to 400 and this is pretty close to 600. And I know that if I change those, I can add that up in my head. 400 plus 600 is 1,000. So notice I didn't follow the strict rounding rule because if I had, I'd have rounded this to 700. But instead of using the strict rounding rules, we are estimating and looking for compatible numbers. So that's the difference between compatible numbers and strictly rounding. So for this one, we'd look at that and say, oh, 32 plus 76, I want to be able to add that in my head or estimate that amount in my head. And this is close to 30, and 76 is close to 70. And I know I can add 30 and 70 in my head, and I will end up with 100. Okay, if we were using strict rounding rules, we would round this to 80. But instead, I'm thinking compatible numbers and estimation. So again, with this one, 875 and 245, I can say, oh gosh, that is pretty close to 800, and this is pretty close to 200. So that's going to be pretty close to 1,000. Now, I know it's going to be a little bit over 1,000 because of the 75 and the 45, but when you're estimating, you're trying to get a number that's pretty close, but it doesn't have to be exact. You're trying to add things in your head. You're using mental math. And when we use mental math, we want to use numbers that we can keep and hold in our minds and add them up or subtract them. But for this chapter, we're adding.